Welcome everyone to the final plenary on mass culture in the age of debt. We have 3 experts on debt and they prepared their best stuff for you. Our first person is Richard Dienst from Rutgers University, and his paper is called Debt and Utopia.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Paul, for inviting me. Thanks to all of you for staying. Paul made a tribute yesterday to Barbara Harlow. He quoted Barbara saying, "Check your theory against other people's knowledge." I heard that, and I want to cite it again because what I'm going to give you is a strictly theoretical exercise that really only works, if it does at all, in being checked against other people's knowledge. So unlike those old kinds of theory that tried to settle all the questions, this one works, I think, only in dialogue with other people. If it has an alternate title, I would call it The Formatting of Solidarity. Almost exactly 6 years ago to the day, at the end of May 2011, I took part in a panel discussion on the politics of debt at the Brecht Forum in New York City. The other panelists were Bruce Robbins, Jeremy Glick, and Randy Martin. And here I'd like to take this chance to salute Randy's prolific intellectual energies and his personal generosity. I wish he were here. Anyway, at some point in that discussion 6 years ago, someone wanted to know what could be done about the Greek debt crisis, which was then entering an especially acute phase. I didn't have a good answer. I said something about debt strikes and general strikes. But someone said, but that wouldn't put pressure on the European bankers and the bureaucrats. And besides, there had been plenty of strikes already. So it seemed that the best answer anyone in the room could offer would be to hope that a political party dedicated to abolishing the debt might someday be elected. As the fate of Syriza shows, this hope remains cruelly unfulfilled. 2011 was in fact a revolutionary year. Earlier that spring, a Greek documentary, which came out right around the time of the Arab Spring uprisings, this documentary called Debtocracy made the case for debt refusal, gathering testimony from economists and critics like David Harvey, Samir Amin, Gerard Demenil, Kostas Lapavitsas, and others. And later that year, of course, Occupy brought home these arguments to the forefront of debate, and here in this country and elsewhere. 2 years later, in 2013, of course, Andrew Ross published Creditocracy and the Case for Debt Refusal, and this case, I think, today remains more urgent than ever. It would be interesting to argue the difference between debtocracy and creditocracy as perspectives for this. Towards the, I'm sorry to quote him while he's sitting on the stage here. Towards the end of Creditocracy, Ross writes, "I have argued that debtors' resistance is only a prelude to the kind of just and sustainable society where socially productive credit would replace extractive credit as the backbone of the economy. Debt refusal should be in accord with ongoing efforts to build a new economy based on mutual aid, common goods, social cooperation, and public affluence, and a real democracy based on self-organization, full participation, and freedom from all kinds of coercion." So today I want to spend a few minutes thinking about this scenario. How does resistance to debt enable us to pursue a new social and economic vision? What role, if any, does debt have to play in a new economy or a real democracy? Does the refusal of debt as we know it involve the affirmation of other kinds of obligations? Will there be, or have there been, debtors in Utopia? We could go to Thomas More to answer this question, but that's the question hanging over this. I can imagine what you're thinking. Debt and Utopia, surely there must be some mistake. We all associate debt with dystopia, with dysfunctional economies, with dead-end societies and blocked lives. The breakdown of the social safety net drives people into personal debt as soon as they cannot afford to buy food or receive health care or pay for school. Consumer debt invites everyone to participate in the so-called abundance of our age, necessities and luxuries alike, but only if their credit score is high enough. Corporate debt spreads speculative risks throughout the economy, not least through the opaque dealings of the financial sector. And public debt continues to erode democratic sovereignty, discounting the common good according to the priorities and prerogatives of central bankers and bond traders. To be permanently in debt, a mixture of voluntary servitude and collective doom, seems like a basic feature of any dystopia, especially the one we're living through now. So it might seem that the only utopian response to the system of debt is to escape it. And yet recent history shows us that that's not so easy. And I mean not just Syriza, but the fact that in the US at least, neither financial crisis nor debt resistance has stopped the growth of, let's say, household debt, which hit a new high, $12.7 trillion this month, after being knocked down after the 2008 crisis. So do we respond to the seemingly unstoppable spread of debt by raising the stakes? Must Utopia go further, not just to erase the debts we have, but to break the economic and legal apparatuses that create debt in order to ensure that nobody will ever need to go into debt again? Can we even imagine such a society? Would that even deserve the name society? And is that really what we want? What we really, really want? Today, I want to pose the problem of utopian, only a few people after that. Today, I want to pose the problem of utopian indebtedness as a question of discourse. This is just within the constraints of what we can do here. By paying attention to the words we use to talk about our troubles and our aspirations. And to do this in an efficient way, I want to offer a somewhat old-fashioned close reading of a utopian slogan made famous by Karl Marx. The slogan goes like this: from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. I've given this paper before, and a lot of people in the audience have never heard this phrase before, but I hope some of you have. And those who haven't can write it down. I'll read it again. From each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs, with a comma in between. I'm serious, a comma. We don't have time to examine the long history of this phrase. For now, we should simply ask what kind of a sentence it is. Is it a statement of plain fact, a political proposal, a social contract, a legal rule, a moral principle, a maxim for everyday life, or an impossible ideal? Can the sentence stand on its own, inscribed on a banner or slapped on a bumper sticker? Does it strike us as a description of a real or a good or a true state of affairs? What kind of a group, what kind of a timetable, what kind of an us does it call upon? Does it belong on the wall of a kindergarten, in the vows of a civil union, in the honor code of a soccer league, in the constitution of a state, in a universal declaration of human rights, or maybe all of these? For the sake of simplicity, let me say that there are two ways of reading this sentence. First is the modern way. According to various kinds of socialist, social democratic, even capitalist democratic programs, it should be possible, by planning and coordination, to mesh or reconcile individual abilities and collective needs. The sentence, in other words, is an equation to be solved by adjusting, adding and subtracting, shaping and reshaping, so that we don't even think of our abilities except insofar as they address some larger need. And we don't even think of needs except insofar as they can be satisfied by the available resources of the society. Each one and all together compose a virtuous circle or a noiseless feedback loop. Or at least that would be the ideal towards which we're all supposed to be working, even if we suspect that the two sides of the equation don't actually balance. According to the second view, let me just give away the game here. I suspect that most of us go around thinking according to that first view. And so that's what I want to question. And I think that our default or spontaneous utopian impulses often fall into that According to a second view, however, our abilities and our needs do not fit together, either at the level of an individual lifetime or at the level of any conceivable social organization, let alone at the level of collective history. Perhaps abilities and needs speak different languages, expressing rather different dimensions of experience or existence. Rather than offering a promise of reconciliation, this utopian sentence expresses a necessary disarticulation. And so maybe its appeal consists precisely in its demand that we acknowledge these two otherwise incommensurable dimensions of life: abilities and needs, work and desire, giving and taking, supply and demand, private and public, or what might be called contribution and provision. Now look at the first phrase again: from each according to their abilities. It does not tell us what to do, but only that we must do what we can. The injunction is both general and absolutely particular. Everyone must do something, but each will do something different. Strictly speaking, the phrase makes no reference to other people, let alone to a division of labor. We're not asked to do our fair share or to do our bit. Instead, the words from each inflect mere doing towards doing more fully. As Gilles Deleuze says, quote, "To do all we can is our ethical task, properly so called." In the same vein, Bertolt Brecht's Chinese sage Métis says, quote, "I have not found many thou shalt statements that I have had any desire to propose. I'm talking about statements of a general nature, statements that could be addressed to everybody. But one such statement is, thou shalt produce." So this is a radical injunction. In Brecht's lexicon, production means something much more than labor or output. It evokes both creativity and engagement. It drives an emphatically open-ended, even future-oriented learning process. In this spirit, then, we could say that acting according to one's abilities does not merely deploy some individual set of skills or capacities. Instead, it is the most general way of acting, the active element in acting itself, potentially unfolding upon multiple lines of becoming, none fixed in advance by physical or mental characteristics. We do not just have abilities, we develop them or neglect them in the course of acting them out in relation to others. We do not yet know what we can do, as Deleuze keeps reminding us. The task of learning what we can do is thus the first obligation. We owe it to ourselves to be able to do more and to do better. I would say that this leads into a whole different conception of pedagogy than I'm used to. How would I teach all of my classes differently if the slogan over the door is from each according to their abilities? Now, look at the second phrase, to each according to their needs. What indeed are our needs? Who or what could ever promise to satisfy them? How strictly do we distinguish between needs and desires? Even the attempt to identify basic needs faces immediate practical complexities. What is most basic? Food, shelter, $2 a day? Is that good enough for Utopia? Are our needs generated in raw necessity, or are they perhaps experienced as an attempt to escape it? Are needs defined by scaling up from bodily processes, or by scaling down from universal species scale requirements? So again, I could quote Adorno in Minima Moralia. There is tenderness only in the coarsest demand, that no one shall go hungry anymore. Every other demand seeks to apply to a condition that ought to be determined by human needs, a mode of human conduct adapted to production as an end in itself. That is to say, the wrong kind of production. He fears that any elaboration of the notion of needs beyond hunger will justify runaway production, consumerism, and all the plagues of the capitalist world. Is hunger, then, our only pure need, distinct from all desires? Should we test all our needs against the standard of hunger in order to decide which ones are truly necessary? I think this way of talking about needs seems obsolete, and not just because of the expansion in the material resources and productive forces in the decades since Adorno wrote. In fact, the debate over defining and demanding basic needs has long veered between the horizon of perpetual scarcity to the horizon of potential abundance. For the moment, my objection to the perspective of scarcity will take the utopian path. Rather than shrink needs and demands to the culture of austerity, which is being urged on us from all sides, we should see how far we might expand needs within the sphere of collective satisfaction, precisely by seeing the link between needs and debts as constitutive. The key point is that our common needs can only be conceived and satisfied through an acceptance of a general obligation. Such needs are active and anticipatory, driven by a force of vital persistence and perseverance. Even when they are minimal, our needs animate the full circumference of our lives, touching upon the needs of others at every point. Now then, can these two obligations, to do what we can and to provide what we need, compose a way of life? So in conclusion, I'll outline some suggestions. It follows that there's no single utopian program to address the possibilities of debt. So let me distinguish between four different utopian impulses that animate much of our discussion about debt and a better life. First, I would point to perhaps the most obvious utopian scenario, the utopia of enclaves, where more of life is recentered in households or small units organized as communes, the minimal unit of solidarity. As though, having been burned by markets, we shrink to the smallest possible group. There are many varieties of this utopia that keep getting tried, from monasteries and survivalist compounds to squats and autonomous zones. In every case, though, such utopias are characterized by a kind of withdrawal, by an island imaginary, in keeping with Thomas More's original scheme. The second utopia I'll call the utopia of taxation. And you could run this as a thought experiment. In order to provide for social goods, we can imagine new income taxes. Why not new wealth taxes? And why not total income tax or total wealth tax? In other words, why stop anywhere along the line except at the constant taxation of everything people produce? A rearrangement of all, that would require a rearrangement of all incentive structures, where tax would be redefined as a gift, but a gift that is perpetually calculated. So this is a total capture of the excess of production. And it would force us to surrender both intergenerational continuity, but also a sense of lifetime accomplishments. And maybe that's a price we'd be willing to pay. Third, I would say there's a utopia of service. This is in keeping with something that Michael Denning said the other day, that maybe we should understand all work as service work. And this might be approached also through Frederick Jameson's recent utopian text, where he proposed a mandatory draft of all people from 16 to 62, I think was the age, into a national army. So this is an erasure of wage work in favor of cultivating abilities or even accepting drudgery, where work itself becomes one's life activity, and what we do is more or less indifferent to us. And then finally, you could imagine a utopia of use, where everything is treated as a common good, or as Agamben says, what is common is never a property, but only the inappropriable. So we would have to give up the notion of property or possessions, and instead understand that we should use ourselves and each other and the world only insofar as we need to. I think this is the most elusive and strangest of the four utopias. It requires a kind of ascetics of needs. And here we might turn to Epicurus, who taught us to distinguish between different kinds of needs. Epicurus said there were three kinds of needs. The natural and necessary needs that we can satisfy. But he says those, whatever we need, we can get easily. The second kind of need are the natural and not necessary needs, the little pot of cheese that would be nice to have. but those are also pretty easy to get. But then the third kind that he prohibited, the unnatural and unnecessary needs. But if you're keeping count, you know that there's a fourth logical possibility, which is perhaps the utopian need, which is to say the unnatural needs which are nevertheless necessary. And perhaps it's only by going through all of the blocked attempts to say what is necessary and what is natural that we come to understand that needs need to be defined in this fully human and therefore utopian way. Maybe this is all cultural studies has ever wanted to do, to carry out a sustained examination of our abilities and our needs. Maybe in that sense, the utopian aspect of cultural studies can be boiled down to the rubrics of work and desire. These are the two great rubrics. So the study of work as the development of our productive capacities, and the study of desire as the collective articulation of needs. These are perhaps the only disciplines we need, and in a utopian sense, therefore we say abolish the English department and the sociology department and all the rest, and run only courses, conduct only lessons in work, desire, and of course, utopia. Thank you.
At the end, is that okay with everybody? Our second speaker is Carolyn Hardin from the University of Miami University, and her talk is called "The Emperor's New Clothes: Risk and the New Calculus of Capitalism." Sorry.
Hi. I want to thank Paul and the organizers of the conference, and also just point out Brett Williams' book, Debt for Sale, was the first book I ever read about debt, so you can blame her for everything that I say. And I also want to thank Richard and Andrew. It's really lovely to be here to speak with you today. So I'm going to do a little math, forgive me, but I think it is necessary and important when we're talking about culture in the age of mass debt. And I'm going to start with the classical formula of capital presented by Marx, which is MCM prime. Many of you are familiar. It represents the circulation of capital, or rather, the transformation of money into commodities, M-C, and then into money again, -M, with a prime added, surplus value, that circulation through money and commodities seems to beget. It would seem that in the course of capitalism, there is a magical moment in which, by virtue solely, we'll get there, of money becoming a commodity and then becoming money again, that is through the production and sale of commodities, capital increases itself. There's a difference between M and M prime, what I want us to think about just for this moment as a spread. M prime is larger than M. The difference, the spread, is the value added in circulation. And this is what makes capitalism so magical for capitalists. The wonder of capital is that through circulation, a spread in money can be constituted. A little extra can be gained. That's where we get our profit. Now, of course, we know that Marx's contribution was to show us that capital is not magical at all, and specifically that the spread between M and M prime is constituted not by the circulation of capital through money and commodity forms, but by something not in the equation at all. Neither money nor the commodity is the location of the magic of capital. It is labor, the thing that transforms money into commodities, labor that actually allows the prime to be added to the M. As Marx explains, the capitalist is able to pay the laborer a wage that does not match the value of that which he produces. The laborer is the secret ingredient, making more than he consumes and thereby providing the surplus that the capitalist, by virtue of the organization of society, appropriates for himself. This is all review. Marx's contribution has many important facets, but I want to focus for this moment on the issue of labor being the source of this magical spread between M and M prime in MCM prime, and the way that he defines labor. Labor is a very interesting concept for Marx. It's not any human activity that transforms material. That is what he calls, quote, productive activity. Work for the production, not merely of a useful item, but for the production of a commodity to be exchanged in capitalism, he calls labor. And labor is both drawn from its progenitor, productive activity, and utterly perverted and alienated from it. It takes something quite basic to human existence and makes it a strange ingredient in a very specific and nefarious process, the appropriation of surplus value. Now, I'm doing this review today because I see in this current moment an apparatus that's both very similar in logic to the one that Marx describes, and also one in which the key terms are different and relate directly to the theme of this conference. So I'm going to start by describing what I see as a correlate or analogous term to Marx's productive activity. Obligation is foundational for social life in a form that we might call, following David Graeber, reciprocity, following Richard Dienst, indebtedness, or following my own work with Lawrence Grossberg and Mike Palm, a structure of feeling of obligation. That is, at base, sociality is not about competition, the survival of the fittest, or altruism and sacrifice, but about bonds of giving and receiving an obligation to one another as individuals, families, groups, tribes, communities, and nations. Mutual obligation is a basic building block of human sociality. And in that role, it's not a risky thing at all, quite the opposite. Mutual obligation is a form of security. The person in a community indebted to no one and to whom no one is indebted is the pariah. Classical texts of economic anthropology and sociology find simple examples of mutual obligation in so-called primitive societies, the famous example being the gift economy, that's really an economy based on reciprocal gift giving of an underlying system of mutual obligation. But obligation as social foundation is very much a part of our everyday lives right now. Think of the social indebtedness of neighbors who look after each other's children, or trade off hosting dinner. Think about the obligation to bring a gift to your host, the obligation to warn others of your contagious cold, and the many simple gestures of gifting back and forth that must continuously be performed in order to balance our collective social account. There is a messy, complex system of obligations stringing us all together, one of which we do not take account, but rather feel the pull when we remember to send a birthday card or hand someone their fallen credit card as they walk away from us. The feeling, rather than the accounting, is what makes this obligation a structure of feeling and not an economic system. Social obligation at base brings with it intimacy, community, and security. So I would suggest that we could see social obligation as analogous to Marx's productive activity. But Marx finds productive activity transformed into a very different thing in labor. And so we also can see the transformation of this intimate and communal social obligation into what I want to call risky indebtedness. Risky indebtedness is something abstracted and fundamentally altered that bears a resemblance to its more fundamental ancestor, but exists for very different purposes. Risky indebtedness is that activity whereby we promise to pay Chase Manhattan for the coffee and bagel we purchase on credit today. Or, of course, the house we move into by paying a fraction of its worth as down payment. It's the risk we take on in an education that we hope will provide a job with wages to repay our student loans. It's the risk that banks take when lending to us and to each other and to Exxon and to Venezuela and so on and so on. We risk the future for our present, both lender and borrower, and we do it without the cozy comfort of future reciprocation. This obligation is not the stuff of dinner parties and babysitting co-ops. It is the stuff of debt collection, financial crises, and austerity measures. Risky indebtedness takes very close account of what is owed to whom and when, and erects a hard and durable structure for keeping those accounts balanced. In this analogy to MCM Prime, then, we see what is working behind the scenes, what is animating the new apparatus, what counts as labor life. It's the condition of risky indebtedness. But then, what is the public face of this capitalist apparatus? Many scholars in the last 2 decades in which debt scholarship has blossomed would, I think, argue that debt itself comes to stand in the place of the great commodity and give us MDM prime. After all, capital operates by circulating, buying, and selling debts themselves. This certainly makes sense in a time when 80% of Americans own credit cards and have mortgages. And of course, there is securitization, the process by which many debts, mortgages, student loans, credit cards, are bundled and sold in slices to investors who buy them, right? These mortgage-backed securities, asset-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations, and the entire wave of derivatives referencing them seem to constitute a new monstrous collection of commodities, just in a new form that has lost some of the hard materiality from the days of industrial production. I want to argue that this is actually a misreading of the current moment that, like classical political economists, mistakes capital rather than labor as the true engine of surplus value production. Debt, of course, matters, but in this apparatus, it functions more as capital itself than as a commodity. In the US context, debt is ubiquitous, but only for what it can do to increase production, consumption, and wealth. As I learned working for a residential building company from 2005 to 2007, just as the housing bubble was reaching its zenith, buying residential home lots with cash is bad business. The interest rate one paid for a builder's loan was actually lower than the money that could be made by investing cash in financial markets. Financiers wouldn't dream of investing a huge pile of unlevered cash. Cash is used merely as a reserve against which loans can be made. Profit comes not from the investment of cash, but from the strategic use of leverage, which is the polite financial term for borrowing 10 to 30 times the amount of cash that you actually have on hand. Cash is no longer king, debt is. No, the C in MCM prime, the correlate of the commodity, is not debt, it is risk. Debt themselves do not have prices. In fact, debts are these odd liminal things without substance or value in and of themselves because they don't exist in the present moment in the same way that a house does. They are uncertain, without substance, only fully completed when they are paid off and thus cease to exist. So what's the worth of a mortgage loan? How do we value it? Perhaps at the moment of its creation, it's the same value as the home itself, but it certainly doesn't stay that way. That would be a very bad loan indeed, and one that a bank would not make. If the borrower was able to just reappraise the house to get the value of their loan, they'd have every incentive to let it deteriorate during the life of that loan. We know, of course, that the answer is the value of a debt or a loan is the amount of money extended, the principal, plus some amount of interest, right? This is the fudge factor to account for the strange liminality of the future projection of repayment in the future of the loan. But what should that interest rate be? That question, the question of what a loan made to a borrower will eventually return to the lender, the question of principal plus interest, is the defining question of finance and indeed the current debt-financed economy. The question in this particular moment is answered with a calculation of risk. Now I'm putting risk in scare quotes because, as I'm going to argue, I don't think risk is what we assume it is at all. It is perhaps the most consequential calculation in all of capitalism. It is the most determining factor in any given deal. It is the thing that will determine if a project can begin or not, whether a home will be bought or not, whether a potential employee will be hired or not, and yet it is as unsubstantial a notion, as impossible a calculation, and as fetishized a social fact as one can possibly imagine. Risk is the emperor's new clothes, the reason for the party, and yet utterly imaginary. But first, let's walk through the risk calculation as it exists in this imaginary splendor. Let's describe the emperor's clothes before remarking on his nakedness. How do we price a debt? If the repayment of a loan is all but certain, and the paradigmatic case here is the sovereign debt of the United States government, its worth can be determined based on a very low rate of interest. I can know when purchasing a treasury bond exactly how much interest I will receive over the life of the bond, and I will get the principal back in full. If a loan is uncertain, such as a subprime mortgage, the fact that it will be repaid at all is uncertain. Unlike the bond, there's some collateral, the underlying house, that can reassure the lender to an extent, But still, delinquency, foreclosure, housing downturn, all of these are possibilities that must be, quite rationally, accounted for in order for the lender to be willing to offer the subprime borrower a mortgage at all. Thus, a higher rate of interest will be required. The value of the mortgage is the principal plus that interest over the life of the loan. In effect, the accounting of the risk and the production of the interest rate that correlates to that risk is the thing that allows the loan to exist at all. Its risk must be accountable for the lender to undertake it, and once that accounting is done, then the debt can have a price. But make no mistake, the price belongs to the risk, not to the debt. The debt is the thing that allows the thing of value, risk, to be engaged, just as capital is only useful insofar as it allows commodities to be produced and sold in order to realize value. Interest is very clearly the apparent source of M prime in our new formula, MR M prime. Risk is the thing that we buy, sell, and trade to realize surplus value. Finance today is entirely about the pricing of risks. Risk is not danger, it's the absolute source of profit. Let's go back to securitization, the process by which mortgages and other debts are bundled and sold to investors. In a typical subprime mortgage securitization deal before the financial crisis, the interest borrowers would pay on their mortgages could be as much as 8 or 9%, depending on the type of mortgage and the borrower's credit score. The monthly income to a typical deal, which would have been about $1 billion worth of mortgages, would thus have been huge, 8 or 9% of $1 billion. Now, the securitizers did not pass this income directly to the investors who bought up slices of the mortgage bundle. Instead, citing diversification and using sophisticated models to predict the risk that any given slice of the bundle would be impacted if borrowers defaulted on their individual mortgages within the pool, securitizers were able to show investors that the risk of their individual slice was very minimal. They got credit rating agencies to certify that 80% of the typical securitization deal had AAA credit ratings. Credit ratings function sort of like FICO scores for financial securities. They were proxies of risk, and AAA meant perfectly safe. As we know, in this apparatus, a debt that is perfectly safe requires very little interest. So investors in mortgage-backed securities got just that, very little interest. The difference between the enormous income from the subprime mortgages that made up the pool of the securitization deal, where borrowers were paying 8 to 9% interest, and the minuscule interest paid on the mortgage-backed securities certified AAA, was an enormous profit for securitizers. Throughout the early 2000s, continued demand for those profits drove mortgage brokers to initiate ever riskier loans to people with barely any hope of ever paying them back. Now, I tell this story not so that we can rail against the terrible securitizers or the immoral credit raters or the exploitative mortgage brokers, but to show that it was the spread, the difference between M and M prime, the interest paid to investors on the one hand and the interest received from subprime borrowers on the other, that animated the housing bubble and provided the profits to securitizers. And this instance is not unique. The search for spread is the defining activity of finance. To reiterate my position, the defining activity of our debt economy is not the issuance of debt. It's the pricing of risks. The ability to price risk and to put them into circulation is a story that can be read off the recent history of consumerism and finance in the US. Whereas in the early days of credit cards, 1 or 1.5% per month interest was standard, but cards were only issued to qualified, which meant white, male, and middle class borrowers. Today, anyone can get a credit card, as long as they have a credit score, i.e. a priceable risk profile, and are willing to bear the interest rate they're given. Banks who once made loans and waited for them to be paid back now refuse to deal directly with high-risk borrowers, instead making loans to payday lenders, rent-to-own stores, and rapid tax refund joints. Both the banks and these fringe lenders play the spread. The bank borrows money from the Fed at a fraction of a percentage point and loans it to the payday lender at 9 or 10%, taking a healthy surplus out of the deal. The payday lender pays the 9% from the bank to borrow, but lends at 500%. That's a typical low-end average annualized percentage rate on a payday loan, 500%. Even after accounting for high levels of default among their poor clientele, payday lenders earned astronomical profits in the 1990s from this spread and continue to be profitable today. Within the economic logic of financial capitalism, this spread, the risk spread that happens within an M-prime is well justified, just as the profit to the owner of the means of production is. Taking a risk is, well, risky. And shouldn't our brave payday lender or subprime mortgage broker be remunerated for taking that risk? And if he's actually reliable and an upstanding corporate citizen who always pays his debts, shouldn't he deserve to pay less for borrowing than the unreliable payday lender, or the unreliable payday borrower, right? The payday lender deserves his reward both for not being risky himself and for taking a risk on the borrower that he lends to. Except, this puritanical privileging of honoring one's debts as something to be rewarded, and the general formula of assigning an entity a risk profile, obscures the very organization of society in which this apparatus operates. The hidden abode of this apparatus is the risky indebtedness that we are required to undertake, risking our futures for social, not to mention biological, survival. And this risky indebtedness occurs within a structure of social relations between individuals, corporations, and the state in which honoring our debts is both more difficult for the low-income payday borrower and much more required than for the wealthy corporation. Not paying one's debts for a corporation is, depending on the level of crisis in the air, either an action fully sanctioned and promoted by the US government, or a calculated gamble of whether the litigation costs and credit rating downgrades might outweigh the value of the loan itself. For the payday borrower, defaulting on a debt is a moral failing dutifully recorded in the risk profile, or FICO score, that functions as an economic passport for borrowing, insurance, employment, etc. Here is where we need to press harder on the issue of risk, to expose its fetish rather than accepting it as the thing that objectively mediates our economic lives. The relationship between a calculated risk profile, whether of a human or a company or a pool of mortgage loans, and the price given to that risk as an interest rate is, first of all, utterly contingent upon the situatedness of the entity and the rules applied to it. The corporation, afforded the rights and privileges that they are in this age, is at a considerable advantage in setting its own risk profile as safe. As many commentators have noted, credit rating agencies that assign those AAA ratings, or sometimes worse, to mortgage-backed securities or corporate bond issues are hired by the entities that themselves are issuing the debt. Economists bemoan this incentive structure, saying that since a low rating from one agency might lead a bank to simply seek another better opinion at one of its competitors, banks can credit rate shop. And that might mean that banks and corporations can just pay to get a better risk profile. The payday borrower, impacted as she may be by the downward pressure on wages, increasing costs of healthcare, childcare, not to mention the impact of globalization on industry in the United States, is at a considerable disadvantage. Within this context, a great many people don't seem to have much choice but to offer their risk profiles in exchange for debt. Much like primitive accumulation and the enclosures of early capitalism shoved workers into the necessity of labor, many now remark that there is no choice but to live in debt. But even this takes the risk of the borrower too much for granted. For what is risk but the attempt to quantify an unknowable future? What will happen in the future, even in mechanical and biological systems, much less social ones, cannot be predicted by what has happened in the past. The future is contingent, emerging, always becoming a new present, not the repetition of a past present. It may be possible to establish a pattern of the relationship between the past and presents that have subsequently occurred, but that pattern could, with each new emergence of a new present, be disrupted. Reifying those patterns into objective facts misses the fundamental nature of the relationship between the past and the future. There is something paradoxical, then, about assigning a stable value, like AAA or 750, as a measure of future uncertainty. It's a certainty of uncertainty, a mathematical double entendre, the measure of the immeasurable. Risk, then, is really and truly a fudge factor. It is a term whose objectivity serves to entrench a system in which high interest rates, paid by the very poorest and least secure individuals, transfer wealth to the more secure. When that objectivity is at best structured in advance to harm those who are already disenfranchised, and at worst, not really structured at all, just a nonsensical mathematical label conjured for profit's sake alone, remote from any reality it might portend to represent. This certainly appears to be the case with all those credit ratings of the mortgage-backed securities, which turned out not to be super safe. The issue wasn't that credit raters got them wrong, though. It's that they issued them at all. In the moment of issuing a credit rating, they not only assigned a stable, supposedly objective measure to something that by definition is uncertain, but the profit appropriated from the spread and the risks of mortgage loans and mortgage-backed securities would not have existed at all if that measurement had not taken place. In other words, it makes no difference if the emperor has no clothes as long as we all accept that he does. It makes no difference that we are not our risk profiles as long as the system ensures that we all act as if we are, as long as we all remember that we must pay our debts or else our FICO scores will go down and we will be unable to get another loan or a job or a place to live. If this calculus is true, and I think it is, it has two major implications. First, in focusing on indebtedness and its rampant spread and terrible effects, we may be making the same mistake the political economists before Marx made, in seeing the magic of capitalism in self-expanding capital rather than in labor. We must focus as much on risky indebtedness and the fetish of risk as that which produces this particular breed of capitalist debt. Of course, I'm not suggesting that risk itself is under-examined. Research on the decline of the welfare state, on growing precarity, on preoccupations with risk and prediction in government, not to mention in novels and film, and of course risk in financial markets has flourished. But we must tie this research up with the debt story we're trying to tell. In short, to understand debt, we must press harder on the concept of risk. The fact is, we're not exerting political pressure on risk, on the ubiquity of the FICO score, on the absurdity of risk-based pricing of debt, on the utter hegemony of the search for spread in finance. These things simply are, and they need to be made much more strange than we're allowing them to be. Second, by focusing on risky indebtedness and the search for risk spreads as the capitalist lender's highest goal, we can begin to see the operations of this debt economy more clearly. For example, much of debt scholarship focuses on increasing discipline of debtors who do not pay their debts. The 2005 Bankruptcy, Abuse Prevention, and Consumer Protection Act made it nearly impossible to discharge student loans in bankruptcy, and much harder to discharge credit card debt. Collection practices include deceitful and often baseless court filings that many debtors simply never find out about. Navient, the Sallie Mae spinoff that services student debt, is the single most despised corporation in the US, which is unsurprising because they're also responsible for garnering Social Security disability benefits of people with student loans. But this only tells half the story. Debtors are in fact not solely disciplined to be good little self-calculating entrepreneurial neoliberal subjects so that they can all get 750 credit scores and access good debt. Good debtors, the ones who only borrow for college and their homes and pay their credit card balances in full each month, have long been labeled deadbeats by credit card companies. Capitalism requires risky indebtedness for its spread. It needs some potential for default, a little uncertainty in the debtor's future, so that it can produce a spread between the cost of borrowing from the Federal Reserve or a big bank and the cost of lending to little old you. It needs reckless spenders, but disciplined payers. We should pay high interest rates, but be locked into a scary system in which default, though we are obviously essentially prone to it, is really difficult. We need to spend a little too much to pay our debts, but to not plan ahead, to take on too much debt, since quantity certainly does matter, and fall behind, but never give up completely. We need bad credit histories to justify high rates, but less and less the ability to actually get out of paying back. This might seem like a fundamental contradiction, but it works just fine. Splurging is a very basic foundation of our consumer culture. You might have a Puritan ethic when it comes to work and minding that your bills are paid, but when it comes time to spend, it's YOLO. You only live once. It's recognizing that taking your kid to a baseball game might cost $123, as that 2005 MasterCard commercial showed us, but getting to have a conversation with him is priceless, because you're working your ass off to pay back $123 at 20% interest. The problematic of the debt economy becomes wider and more complex when we recognize that discipline is rather surgically applied to only one part of our subjectivity, while its polar opposite is applied to another. This sort of insight isn't just interesting. It's necessary to form any kind of politics that might move us out of this apparatus. How can we rethink refusing debt as also refusing that priceless narrative that tells us to value only the moment we are in? Or also refusing the idea that the past predicts the future, and is also refusing the very notion that risk deserves reward. To understand the importance of culture in the age of mass debt, then, we must refocus on risk. We need to stop accepting the fundamental idea that risk is real, that risk is measurable, that risk requires remuneration, and that that remuneration justifies 500% interest on payday loans. In short, we need to take note of the emperor's nakedness and tell a friend.
Our final speaker is Andrew Ross from New York University, and the title of his paper is Kings of Debt.
So my title comes from an interview that Donald Trump did with Wolf Blitzer a little over a year ago, when he told Wolf, "I am the king of debt. I love debt." And so on and so forth. And be that as it may, the accurate estimates of Donald Trump's personal liabilities are difficult to come by. For all sorts of reasons, but they probably don't come anywhere close to the $3 billion and upwards that he owed in the course of the bankruptcies in the 1990s. And the major banks soured on him after these bankruptcies, and as the rumor has it, that's when he turned to the Russians, for loans and guarantees and so on and so forth. But with the king of debt in the White House, who would bet against some version of the debt crisis, the revival of some version of the debt crisis that swamped the global economy after 2008? In January, actually, the Congressional Budget Office issued its first projection of the projected rise in federal debt of $10 trillion over the next 5 years, simply based on Trump's policy proposals. And I think even if only a fraction of these policy proposals were realized, we're unlikely to see GOP lawmakers grandstanding once again around the so-called fiscal cliff. Remember that song and dance about falling off the fiscal cliff from a few years ago? Not even the deficit hawks, I think, will get into that business. It's not an especially risky proposition for a country like this to run very high levels of sovereign debt. I mean, it's a country with a fiat currency that can print money at will. Nor is there really any correlation whatsoever between national debt, public debt, and household debt, unless you have in your household a bunch of counterfeiters who can print that money. But that doesn't stop policymakers from making the connection whenever they want to justify new austerity measures, for example, and that's precisely what Barack Obama did after the stimulus package ran out. 2010, in his State of the Union speech, he drew this correlation between all these cash-strapped families that have to tighten their belts in their households, and therefore it's only fair that the federal government should freeze spending for the next few years in a sort of direct correlation between these two. So how have these cash-strapped families fared in the intervening years? Well, after 2008, it was about 5 years of notable decline in household debt, largely, I would say, as a result of banks writing off non-performing loans. But that deleveraging bottomed out in the third quarter of 2013 when the numbers started to rise again. And they've continued to rise, and as Richard pointed out earlier, the first quarter of this year, that we were right back up to the peak, 2008 peak of aggregate household debt, $12.7 trillion. The only real major difference is if you look at the numbers, the slice of aggregate household debt that is there for student debt has doubled over that course of time from 5% to 10%. And that's what makes, of course, the U.S. a big outlier in that respect. What are the reasons for the upturn in numbers? Lots of reasons. I would mention three. One is an obvious one, that increase in income for most of us has been outpaced by the increase in costs of food and shelter and education and healthcare. Secondly, the banks, which were in financial lockdown for 5 years until 2013, hoarding their cash reserves, they jumped back into the lending game when it became obvious that their officers, chief officers, were not going to be criminally prosecuted. And thirdly, economists played a big role in this, the court poets. Economists, including folks like Paul Krugman and the like, persuaded us that it was safe to start borrowing again. And in fact, it may be necessary to do so, they argued, if we're to get GDP-driven growth back on track, which is a recipe for ecological collapse, but that's a whole other discussion. Well, as you probably know, GDP growth hasn't exactly rebounded in this country and in most other industrialized countries. In fact, none of these countries has managed to reduce its debt to GDP ratio during that period of time. And as for global debt, global gross debt, combination of public and private liabilities, it's just gone through the roof in those years, every year breaking new records. And in the last quarter of 2016, global gross debt was at 225% of global GDP, which is much greater than any single country, but an astonishing figure by any lights. So as a result, debt servitude, what you might call debt servitude, is now pretty universal. It used to be the preserve of the global South nations in the era of the so-called debt trap, but it's now pretty universalized. Every day, the daily obligation of nations, households, businesses, and individuals to perform a high level of debt service is now absolutely central to capitalist profit-taking. And lifelong financial extraction has become a dominant, if not the dominant model of 21st century capital accumulation. So the result is that we're living in the kind of society that I call a creditocracy, where people are very deeply in debt that can never be repaid and is not supposed to be repaid. And the gut liberal response to that is to say, well, that's not fair. We shouldn't have debt that can't be repaid, and why would the creditor class want that anyway? Well, this is the wrong question. The creditor class wants to have us on the hook for as long as possible. It doesn't want us to pay off our debts entirely, because then we're no longer generating profit. So for the same reason that credit card issuers don't want you to clear your balance at the end of the month. If you do that diligently, then, as Carolyn said, you're referred to in industry parlance as a deadbeat. They don't want deadbeats. What they want are revolvers. And revolvers are the folks who maybe pay the minimum, pay penalties, pay merchant fees, roll the credit over, and so on and so forth. The goal in a creditocracy is to make lifelong revolvers of all of us and to keep us on the hook until the day we die and beyond the grave, because we know some debts live on beyond the grave. And I say that because statistically there's been a marked generational shift in the share of the debt burden towards the elderly in the last 15 years or so. Largely because more and more parents and grandparents are obliged to co-sign student loans. And you can see that very clearly. And what that means is that contrary to the post-war model of life cycle lending, where it was understood that the elderly would enjoy or be able to earn over a lifetime a debt-free respite on retirement, what we're seeing now is lifetime extraction, capturing the elderly in the last lap of their lives. So I think there's a difference between a rampant market civilization where every social good can be turned into a transactional commodity, and a creditocracy where the cost of access to these social goods has to be debt financed, and where therefore indebtedness becomes a precondition, not just for material improvements in life, but for meeting the basic requirements of life, if not bare life itself. And that's a significant shift. And in that kind of society, the goal of the creditor is to wrap debt around every possible asset and income stream, to put a toll booth, if you like, on every possible revenue source, thereby generating a flow of interest from each in turn. And furthermore, when fresh credit is needed to service existing debts, then we're entering into a more advanced phase of creditor rule. And when that happens, you have a situation, I mean, the bumper sticker version of this is, I use MasterCard to pay my Visa, right? There was an institutional formalization of this in the so-called debt trap in the 1960s and 70s, which put paid to the development aspirations of so many global South countries. Remember, this is when the IMF came along and said, well, we'll issue a fresh round of loans on certain conditions, but the main condition was that you use that money to pay off your northern creditors, or to pay debt service to your northern creditors, rather than to use the money to actually address the social needs of your citizenry. In 2008, the debt trap migrated to the global north, and we saw the same formula being imposed upon peripheral countries in the Eurozone, with the result that the sort of rescue package that the EU Troika offered to Greece was to, for money that would be used to make whole the French and German and Swiss banks, rather than attend to the needs of the Greek citizenry. And so you could also argue, however, that for the working poor, this condition has been very familiar for a long time. The classic expression under feudalism and indenture and slavery, successor institutions like sharecropping, company scrip, loan sharking, and the legacy of all of that continues today down into the subprime landscape of fringe finance, where all the poverty banks operate in every other storefront in low-income main streets of the world. So the big difference, however, is that we've seen that condition being upwardly mobile in the last few decades and capture large swathes of middle-class populations. So doing this kind of debt service for a lifetime is an existential burden economically, but it also has a political impact. And what is that political impact? We know that the imposition of debt is a very effective form of social control, right? So what is the impact on democracy or citizenship? How can a democracy survive when it's on the road to debt serfdom? What we're seeing actually is failed democracies all over the world as a result of the rollout of the debt crisis, which continues. Wherever you look, Puerto Rico, Greece, Detroit, at any level of government, we're seeing failed democracies because the right of creditors to be made whole now routinely overrides the responsibility of elected officials to look after the needs of their citizenry. In fact, those elected officials are more and more asked to use their government powers to act as kind of debt collection agents to make the foreign bondholders whole, or to pass on the cost of their speculative investments to the most vulnerable populations at home. So this is not just an economic condition, it's a major threat to popular sovereignty at all levels of governance. The historical record shows that when a society cannot check the harmful power of its creditor class, then you see the onset of debt bondage and worse. And I guess the big question is, are we approaching that kind of crossroads again, when democracies segue into oligarchies, hastened on by the circuits of debt? There's a lot of evidence of revival of debtors' prisons. We more or less accepted Jeff Williams' equation of student debt with indenture. A lot of talk about debt jubilees, large debt jubilee movements, the Jubilee South movement of the 1990s, other more recent jubilee movements. This is a concept, as some of you know, that is kind of associated with the Bible, but it's not an act of charity. If you look in the ancient world, rulers in the ancient world issued debt jubilees in order to restore the balance of power in their favor from their the equivalent of their creditor class. So they would wipe the slates clean, free all the debt slaves, and return land to its original owners as a kind of macro solution to the problem of the balance of power shifting away from them. I think in some ways what I've been talking about is a preface perhaps to maybe what Richard would accept as a partial utopia, which is what Keynes once described as the euthanasia of the rentier. If we could get to that point, that might be a partial utopia. I want to use the rest of my time, however, now to talk about debt resistance, because I really feel it's an appropriate way to end the conference by talking about resistance and the lessons we can learn from debt resistance and debt resistance movement or initiatives that I've been involved in for the last several years. I'm just going to mention some of them quite briefly or summarize them and maybe extract a few lessons. My participation began with the formation of the Occupy Student Debt Campaign in the fall of 2011 in the heyday, the heat of Occupy. And we were aiming at collective default of 1 million student debtors, very ambitious and hastily devised campaign. We didn't have anything like the resources you need to run a national campaign like that. So we didn't get any, for all sorts of reasons, we didn't get anywhere near these numbers. Ironically, however, 1 million student debtors did default that year and have continued to do so every year. The only problem was they defaulted individually, on an individual basis rather than collectively, which is what we had aspired to. And so there was no political impact. And if they collectively defaulted, we'd be having a different conversation today. We retired that campaign after several months, but in the course of which we learned a lot about the psychology of debtors, and we helped to push the profile of the debt crisis in the public mind at least, and I think in some small way paved the way for, some of the free college proposals that were floated and discussed in the course of the Democratic presidential campaigns last year. In the summer of 2012, we joined together with some other remnants, Occupy remnants, to form Strike Debt, which was a coalition that looked beyond student debt at several different categories of household debt, medical, housing, credit card debt, in addition to student debt. And Strike Debt started off very small, with small-scale debt assemblies. We very quickly grew a national network of Strike Debt chapters in other cities and in some campuses. Over the course of that summer, we produced the Debt Resisters Operations Manual, which has been widely used, been downloaded hundreds of thousands of times from the Strike Debt website. It was a document that was intentionally written in very plain English in order to demystify the intentionally obscure language of the finance industry. That was a project of mutual aid, and defined that way. The second big project was the Rolling Jubilee, which was, again, like the Debt Resisters Operations Manual, conceived as a public education project. The whole idea, really, of the Rolling Jubilee was to publicize the murky, shadowy operations of the secondary debt market, where banks sell their non-performing loans very cheaply for pennies on the dollar, and debt buyers and collection agents pick them up and then go after you for the full amount of the debt. And so the idea was that if we could publicize this enough, people would then know, and I certainly didn't know about these workings of the secondary debt market at the time, and very few of us did. Once it was more widely known, then you would have a different conversation with the debt collector when they call you up to harass you, knowing that they've only paid 5 cents for your debt and are trying to collect on the full dollar, right? You have a different conversation with that person. Even if they only collect 10 cents on the dollar, they're still making off like bandits. So we thought if we raised maybe, say, $50,000, we could, in sort of high-profile act of abolition, we'd wipe out $1 million worth of debt, because we'd been told we could get a ratio of 20 to 1 on the debt buys. We ended up collecting about $700,000 worth of debt over the course of a year, and we got much better ratios and ended up abolishing over $32 million worth of debt. And then we terminated the campaign because it's very labor intensive and it was only intended to be a short-lived thing and make a point and make a very public point and not be a long-term mechanism of debt relief in any way whatsoever. So after the Rolling Jubilee, things kind of devolved again. For us, it was difficult to replicate the hit of the Rolling Jubilee and the national network that we'd grown. We realized wasn't going to deliver the debtors' union that we'd always talked about creating, a debtors' union that would be at the core, that would provide services for debtors and be at the core of a debtors' movement. So a remnant broke off from strike. When strike debt kind of devolved, a remnant once again broke off, and we decided to go back to student debt and to start small. Instead of going after 1 million debtors, which is crazy, you start very small and you build from the ground up. So this was the idea behind the debt collective, which is still in existence. Some of you will know some of that work and urge you to join it. We found a group of students in the Inland Empire in Southern California from low-income minority households. They had been scammed by enrollment in Everest College, which is part of the Corinthian College for-profit network, and they'd been left holding a bag of debt. And thereby were they angry. But they didn't know what to do with their anger. They didn't know how to organize. They had no politically active background. So we said, look, here's a situation where we can act like a kind of prototypical debtors union and offer services, organizing services, legal services, access to publicity, and so on and so forth. And so this group of very brave students went on debt strike, the first debt strike against the Department of Education, because their debt was federal debt. And they were joined by smaller debt collectives, some of them bigger actually, at other for-profit colleges. And we got the support of some state attorney generals, including Kamala Harris in California. And so at the same time, and this was very important, a law student who was part of our group found this loophole in the Higher Education Act, which enjoins the government to discharge debt that has been incurred under fraudulent circumstances for students. It's kind of very vague language, but it's important language. And so then we put together defense to repayment claim forms and helped to file 10,000 on behalf of students directly to the Department of Education. The Department of Education recognized legally they were on the hook and they had to do something about this. But they also knew that if they opened the door too wide, this is a door you could really drive a battalion of Sherman tanks through. Outdated military reference, I know. And so they started paying out very slowly and under very limited circumstances, tried to make it really difficult to file these claims. Nonetheless, by the time of the election last fall, they had pledged to provide debt relief up to $200 million on some of these claims. Along comes the election, along comes Trump, along comes Betsy DeVos. And the Department of Education, everything is up in the air, and we don't really know what's happening for several months. No one knows what's happening with the Department of Education. And in fact, only earlier this week did she announce that, that her Department of Education intended to honor that $200 million worth of debt relief. What happens to the other claims, we don't know. They've always made it difficult to file. But the legal accountability is definitely there and can be built on. And it's not something that is that pertains exclusively to the for-profit sector, right? You just have to make the leap between the for-profit sector and the non-profit sector, which we know is not a difficult one to do, but for some people, they're different moral categories, right? So let me just conclude by saying that these initiatives, and again, I would underline that, you know, $32 million in the Rolling Jubilee, $200 million in the debt collective, they're drops in the ocean of debt, but they are, I guess what in the corporate world you would call proof of concept, right? And the proof of concept that collective action, mutual aid and collective action can produce results. And they're not inconsiderable results. And they can be built on, and given the resources and given the ingenuity, they can be scaled up. And so, lastly, I would say that when it comes to organizing, we've learned that organizing around debt is not easy. It's not like organizing around wages, which ain't exactly easy either. But organizing around debt is particularly difficult because debts are very unique. They're sort of like fingerprints, and it's very difficult to persuade people that it's in their mutual interest to join together with people they don't know who might share the same kind of debt that they have and pursue collective action together. That said, it seems self-evident to me that there is a need to continue that kind of work, and there is a self-evident need for a debtors movement going forward. And for those of you who like neat historical distinctions, let me leave you with one. In the industrial era, conflict over wages was the frontline struggle. Becoming a frontline struggle, not because wage conflict is over, never will be, but because that's quite literally are the wages of the future, to which a creditor class lays claim far in advance. Right? When you take out a loan, you're basically pledging your future wages. And I would go so far as to say debts are a form of wage theft, in a sense. Each new surrender of a part of our lives to debt financing, therefore, further consumes the fruits of labor in the future that we haven't yet performed in the form of compensation that we have not yet earned. And that's why I think a debtors movement, or debt struggles, are a kind of natural extension of the labor movement in all sorts of ways. And perhaps that's why I might very speculatively suggest, again, just responding to Carolyn's comments about the equation, that debt can actually figure both as capital and as labor in that equation in all sorts of ways. So, yeah, I'll just end there. Thank you.
Anyone have a question or a comment?
Hold on.
This is great talks, one and all. This question goes specifically to Andrew. It seems to me that you mentioned that the debt strike, that you're calling for 1 million signatories to declare a debt strike. You had 1 million people default on their loans, they do so individually. And if only they were to do it collectively rather than individually, we have a whole different conversation. It seems to me that that's a kind of performative speech act that re-signifies what, because at the end of the day, like, there's a million debtors who aren't paying their money. 1 million creditors aren't getting the money back. So that's the kind of the realism of debts must be paid, creditors must be paid back seems to be the kind of underlying assumption. And in any case, there are a million cases where that's not happening. So how does one re-signify that? And the parallel to that is in all of the cases where the creditors are kind of making the determination, they're not going to pay this back. I'm going to sell this debt on the secondary market for 4 cents on the dollar. They could simply forgive 96 cents on the dollar and ask the person in debt to pay the 4 cents back. Instead, they're keeping the pressure on the debtor alive by passing that on to the secondary purchaser of the loan. So I'm just curious. Like it seems to me that there are parallel functions between the debtor taking the courage to say, "Hell no, I'm not paying this, and I'm doing it collectively," and a creditor saying, "I'm out the money anyway. Why not simply forgive it and let the debtor off the hook, rather than sell it to the secondary market?" Do you see what I'm saying? And I'm just asking, like, what you see in terms of the parallel between those speech acts.
I think individually, on an individual basis, you can always, the creditor's door is usually always open to you to negotiate in some way or another. It's not that difficult to renegotiate your loans, as you know, your debts. That's always been the case, whether it's individuals or whether it's nations. That's what Global South nations did during the debt trap. They came to the Paris Club, which represents northern creditors. They came and they bowed and they scraped and they said, "Look, we're poor, let's make a deal." What they could not do, however, was go together as a block. That's forbidden. That's a big no-no. So the creditor's door is always open to individuals, but not to collective, not to a collection of individuals. And that's a primary principle. And that, I think, is a principle that is absolutely structural and key, and which is what we were trying to get at in all of these different initiatives. As for, again, this is a partial utopia of these creditors who might decide simply to provide their own kind of debt relief and not sell on the debt. That's a sort of central principle. I think the only instance that we encountered of charitable, let's say, debt buyers on the other side of the other side of the ledger were folks who offered debt very, very, very cheaply to us on the secondary debt market because they had the perception that it was slightly odious. It's this category of odious debt, which is a very particular risk category, right? It's very difficult to calculate in terms of risk. And they gave us some of that debt for really almost nothing. And some of it was actually student debt. Student debt very rarely finds its way onto the secondary debt market. We couldn't find student debt. You can't sell federal debt on the secondary debt market. And most student debt doesn't find its way there. Why? Because it's so profitable. A lot of medical debt out there. We started out buying up a lot of medical debt because it's not so profitable. And in fact, one of the things we discovered was when we contacted the folks to tell them they were no longer on the hook and that their debt had been abolished, some of them said, "Well, that's great, but I thought I paid those debts off a long time ago." And they probably had, but the debts were still sloshing around in the system and had found their way into the hands of these bottom feeders, the collection agents. So that was kind of...
You're probably in debt too, though.
Huh?
You're probably in debt too.
Yeah. The collection agent? I hope so. I hope so. So that was the only instance that when some of the Corinthian college and some of that the imploded for-profit debt found its way onto the debt market, obviously, because it was considered very difficult to collect. That debt buyers sort of gave it to us for almost nothing. But that was the only charitable act we came across on the part of creditors.
I might just add a little bit about the question of why not just let them pay the 4%, and then forgive the other 96. And if you follow the money through, what happens if creditors start doing that is people start expecting it and start being more willing to default, and default eats the spread, I mean, if you have a group of people paying 10% interest and 5 of them, half of them default, then you're really only getting 5% interest. And we want the spread to be 150% interest. So anything that sort of systematically reduces the spread is exactly what you're talking about, something that must be held at bay, even if that's a sort of a symbolic act, because I'm only getting, as a creditor, I'm only going to get the 4 cents back, but it matters that it symbolizes that you shall be disciplined in paying, and what I get out of it is less important than I maintain that discipline.
Got moral hazard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been thinking for a long time that we should organize around debt. And I fully support Andrew's efforts in this way, but is it too complicated to understand for our organizing efforts? I think, and is there a way to add risk in there too? Because I've been working a lot on gentrification and displacement in DC. And I mean, that's all about debt and risk and finance. And it's just so hard to organize around these complicated things, although Richard's book, The Bonds of Debt, really does a wonderful job of showing how debt brings us all together in these kind of liberatory ways. And I'm just wondering if y'all see any potential around that for resistance or revolution or debtors' revolt.
Well, one way to get at that was sort of where I started. In the past few years, I've been looking at one instance after another where the possibility of a politics of debt hit a roadblock. So you could interpret this in some long-range view and say that the struggles have to keep hitting roadblocks, but that'll create a mounting conflict. That seems to be what Andrew is suggesting. That seems most hopeful. But the flip side of this then are the complicated politics, for example, in Europe, the way that the Greek situation has stalled, the way in which various revolts against Europe itself are stalled arguments about debt. So I can't put together a panorama of a single rising, unambiguous resistance to debt. Which is why I wanted to think about Utopia.
When I was thinking about that, I thought more about that in relation to past oppressions. And I was wondering if you think that in each of the way that you think about that, is it translatable into other perceptions of that? I mean, if it would be the debt of one group to another, the debt of the state for an oppressed group, and et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I'll start by going back to something Andrew said a minute ago, which is that when we look at the balance sheets and we see household debt or business debt or sovereign debt, we have to have a complicated train of thought. The problem with the debt system, you might say, is that it renders similar many things that are dissimilar. So that people who need to borrow money to buy food render their debts in the same currency as sovereign governments borrowing. So we have to disaggregate that perception. In that sense, this goes back to something I guess Marcia was just getting at, that you have to re-signify the different kinds of debt. The figure that I keep coming back to is the idea that everywhere there is debt, we can see that map as a kind of negative Xerox, or negative X-ray, negative X-ray of solidarity. So where there are debts concentrated are signs of where solidarity is lacking. And that map changes, you might say, day to day. But what the balance sheets homogenize, our critical work has to distinguish and differentiate.
Well, there's a lot of history that you've invoked abstractly, but one pattern that I would just mention is, the preference for creditors historically to be dealing with elected officials as opposed to absolute sovereigns. The absolute sovereigns sometimes didn't pay back their debts, and elected officials in governments, and especially democracies, were considered a much more efficient means of debt collection agency than absolute sovereigns. They have the powers of taxation, and they in response to representation, and so that's one of the ironies of the current landscape that I was evoking in my comments about the failed democracies all over the world now, where we're seeing a sort of supersession of that, or if you like, a very sort of rendering that very transparent, the way in which elected officials use those powers as collection agents. One other example that comes to mind is in Palestine. A lot of my current research is in Palestine, and in the post-Oslo phase in Palestine, in order to ready Palestine for the accession of state and to actually become a state that might be recognized by countries around the world, the economy had to be prepped, had to be burdened with a great deal of debt in order to show that it was debt worthy and that it would be a responsible payer of debt to foreign bondholders and not to foreign donors. That's an offer. It's not industrialization by invitation, but it's statehood by invitation on the part of the international creditor class, that you have to prove that you're capable of being laden down with debt and paying it back quite responsibly. And of course, that has all sorts of implications for household debt. In addition, household debt's a huge problem now in Palestine. It wasn't, pre-Oslo. So these are fresh examples in terms of nationhood or pre-state nations that are worth looking at, I think.
I would ask Carolyn a question. I've noticed a lot lately of a really aggressive marketing of debt to poor people, especially poor young people, like auto loans, and then the debt that brings in every day through their phones. And is this kind of debt also securitized and sold on Wall Street and priced via risk? That seems to me to give it so many more tentacles, kind of.
So the answer is some of it is. Some fringe banking loans do find a way into sort of short-term debt security investments on Wall Street. A lot of them do not. Auto title loans, rent to own, that kind of thing, are basically clombed onto this idea of risk-based pricing when it was relatively fresh in the 80s and 90s. I mean, there wasn't really risk-based pricing of debt before the 1960s in the United States. You got debt or you didn't, and there was an interest rate on it that everybody paid, right? And then the idea that we were going to stratify debt, whereby, the best, most rich, most wonderful people had to pay 2%, and then the dregs of society paid 500%, is something that emerged alongside the sort of financial system that we have today from the 1970s into today. So what you have people like Martin Eakes at the Center for Responsible Lending pointing out very clearly that the risk-based pricing justification sort of lifted off from reality, jumped the shark as it were, right? And just kept going because why not, right? If you can charge somebody 80% interest, why not charge them 150%? Why not charge them 1,000%, which is what some payday loans actually bear on an annualized basis? And payday lenders and fringe bankers will say, well, why would you quote an annualized figure for an auto title loan that lasts 2 weeks? We know that a large proportion of people who get these loans roll them over and keep them for half a year or longer. So it really is stratified in that extreme of a way. It wasn't sort of necessary to get the shove of demand from Wall Street for the fringe bankers, because it was a rhetorical figure that just worked and nobody's challenged it, right? And there's not a lot of other options for people to have that short-term lending that they need at a reasonable price. And the lobbying door is, 10 foot deep and made of stainless steel, so.
I wondered about addressing debt on the back end, right? I mean, what to do about forgiving debt, or are these collective actions to not pay debt back? But what about the issue of those of us that feel like I am going to take on this debt because this is a degree that I want and I have no other way of funding it? And how do we address the debt avoidance? You know.
You want to start, Andrew?
Well, in my comments, I mentioned learning something about the psychology of debtors. I mean, it was our experience that student debtors don't actually think of themselves as debtors. They certainly don't think of themselves as debtors until the time comes when they have to start paying back their debts. But that goes for all debtors. Most people don't think of themselves as debtors until they can't make payments. Right? You have a mortgage, you make monthly payments, your bank makes monthly payments. You don't even think about it, right? You don't write the check. You don't think of yourself as a debtor. You think of yourself as a homeowner. That's your identity. But when you can't make the payments, that's when you become a debtor. That's where that identity kicks in, right? So I think for a lot of students, and financial education has improved a little bit in this area, partly because of the the widespread circulation of knowledge about the debt crisis. But it hasn't improved all that much, and there's a lot of folks along the way of vested interest in pulling the wool over the eyes, and making the relationship very obscure as possible. And a lot of these people are recruitment agents for colleges, as we know, and not just for-profit colleges. So whether a 17-year-old, 18-year-old is capable of making those decisions is the big issue. I mean, they're not old enough to drink in most states. How can they make those decisions? How can they recognize themselves as debtors and have that sort of lifetime of consequences roll out before them? If I was in that position, I would be in denial too. Total denial. I wouldn't want to think about a lifetime of consequences simply for signing, a loan form. I'm not trying to evade your question. I'm just trying to, summon up some of the mentality, perhaps, that people in that position.
I guess my question is, are there alternatives? Or does a young middle-class individual that has mediocre grades but wants to go to college and doesn't have any money, what else can they do besides strap themselves with debt?
Well, there are macro alternatives like free college. I mean, you have a job in a free college system now in Mexico, just south of the border. It's a perfectly good university system. It's entirely free. Mexico's a poor country relative to this one. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So for sure, yeah, there are macro solutions, and we're much further down the road, I think, in terms of public and legislative morality with the free college option than we were just a few years ago. I mean, there's been a lot of headway there. I'm not going to dismiss that. So I think it's maybe not, I would say it's not the right question to focus on that individual's mentality, because that individual is incredibly isolated, doesn't have access to the resources. And it's not our fault, it's not that person's fault either. But there are other ways that we can try to intervene with a debtors movement that will make a difference in that person's life.
I'm going to add a couple of things. One is, I'm going to actually quote Andrew. I don't know if that's gauche to do it something like this, but he points out in a little article that the amount of money that the Pentagon doesn't account for would pay for free public college for everybody in the country. So it's the part that they lose every year. So public college is something, free college is something to really think about. It's not pie in the sky. But that's also, sort of a political will question that maybe doesn't look great right now. The other thing that I would say in terms of alternatives is the income for the lowest 2 quintiles in this country is relatively flat, especially vis-a-vis the upper 3 quintiles. Household savings has gone almost to nothing. And so there's sort of an economic impulse to get student loans. But I don't think it's quite fair to stop there. I think we also have to realize that there are lots of reasons that people go to college that are not about getting a job, right? Because everybody else is going to college. Because it's accepted that we have to do that. Because college has become the new high school, and everybody says that. And that you have to do it in order to make more money, which is now being disproven, right? And that there's this complex contextual soup of economic, cultural, political factors that shove everybody in that direction. And thinking about avoidance is probably a really good idea, but it shouldn't be sort of a mathematical avoidance. Like, how else do I pay for it? It should be more of a, what are the underlying reasons that we're making this trajectory almost impossible to get off for young people, where they get dumped into $50,000 of debt if they're lucky, right? If they go to a state school. I think beginning to start to ask that question, have that conversation around the dinner table and in the community organizing room and in the state legislature is something worth doing. We might find that college is something that we want to continue to do, and maybe we should use it, use government money to pay for it. But we might also find that the hegemony of the idea of that trajectory is something that we're all just sort of assenting to without thinking about.
I just wouldn't want to experiment with my daughter.
Sure.
And say, don't go to college, your grades are terrible, we don't have any money. And don't worry about it, because who says it really helps? I think that's a leap as a mother to be able to do that, not to speculate as a theorist. Wish you could go to where I was teaching.
Speculate as a mother.
Well, I think that would be unfortunate advice, the way you put it. But that said, there are many other things you could say to your daughter that would direct her, direct her to resources that would perhaps allow her to understand the situation with more depth. But just to build on what Carolyn said, it's very unfortunate that our students have to approach college these days with a transactional mentality, with that calculus in mind. And we also understand why that is the case. You can't fault them for doing that. But if you're thinking about it simply in transactional terms, and you're thinking about how the vocational aspect of college, which is now becoming so normative, the imposition of the vocational aspect, if you look at the statistics and try and match up college education with jobs that are adequate, that require college education, there's a complete mismatch. Most people have heard of the statistic that with a college degree, you'll earn twice as much over the course of a lifetime than if you don't have a college degree, right? Everyone knows that. Doesn't factor in debt service. But even so, the statistic people don't know is that only 27% of jobs in the U.S. workforce require a 4-year college education. I mean, that's... And in fact, the other statistic is that more than half of college graduates that are currently employed are in jobs that do not require a 4-year degree. That's an extraordinary mismatch. And it's completely immoral for, our nation's leaders, but like Obama, who was on his high horse about increasing output of graduation, pointing to China and all these other countries that have higher graduation rates now, as if we have to up our industrial quota of graduates, and there's no real effort in the other end with an industrial policy, any kind of industry that would provide the jobs that are adequate to those graduate degrees. So that's the stats.
But if you don't have a college degree, you become a Trump supporter.
Sorry?
So if you don't have a college degree, you become a Trump supporter.
Well, but I think there's
the,
I'm glad you kind of, and this is something that I think, there's an interesting thread running through there, because I see there's that side of what I think you've also called, Andrew, building sustainable livelihoods, that we shouldn't, there is something about why don't we have a different path for more people that doesn't require college, that, and that has a lot to do with what Michael, that you call the wageless life, that this is now becoming much more common, that there just isn't labor that pays well. But what I was interested in kind of asking, in relation to this recent lawsuit, the Nivient lawsuit, it's something about the kind of morality of paying back the debt, and maybe there's something to sort of speak to. And since this is a cultural studies conference, the culture of making sure that we don't kind of not serve it, that we must service our debt, that there's something about being a good debtor, that I think that in many cases people do think of themselves as debtors, but they see this as some sort of obligation, and so that it is this kind of obligation that you talk about, Carolyn, and that we have this kind of obligation that we have to pay, and that's us being a good citizen on some level. That there maybe needs to be a different kind of financial education about going into bankruptcy or something like that. That should be an option. Because in that Nivient lawsuit, what was interesting is that they kind of planned on a lot of people in the lower income that they were giving these subprime student loans to. They were like, well, we're going to bake this into the whole policy. We're going to assume that they're going to default, right? And the idea is to then get the colleges on the hook and to let them keep us as a creditor for their future students. And the real problem was the students right in the middle who really couldn't pay. They didn't have enough money to pay, but they were trying really hard to pay and weren't given the option of sort of restructuring their debt. And so that idea that they have to keep paying, even though they don't have the wages to pay at the rate that they're being asked. So there is a cultural element there to like basically telling people you shouldn't pay. Like if you can't do it, don't pay. And I don't know, maybe that isn't a question or a comment, but like Paul said, I'm kind of on drugs, so we're just.
So I'll just say something briefly. Maybe I'm loud. I'll say something briefly in response. I think it matters that our current sort of creditocracy is built on top of this social obligation as something that is everyday and normalized and important and communal and intimate and good, right? The fact that debt collectors get to play on our goodness in wanting to pay back, it's not a frivolous point, right? That's a trivial and frivolous, by the way. I just made that up right there because I have a PhD. It's not a trivial point. It matters that that's there. And the one little point that I wanted to add was that Joe DeVille, who's in Manchester, I think, wrote this book about debt and intimacy and the sort of everyday experiences of debt. And he has this beautiful point about debt collections and the experience of debt collectors in hunting people down and getting them to pay. They have a particular category for people who just won't talk to them, right? And that's the write-off category. The people who would talk to them, who would want to give them the time of day, want to pay a little bit, were the people they would call back over and over and over again. The people who would never talk to them, they got sent down this little organizational tube into write-off land. You know, and so that the obligation and debt piece and the connection between the two matters a great deal. I'm trying to.
Yeah, I think the payback morality is absolutely, I mean, it's a whole glue that holds the financial sector together. It would all fall apart without that payback morality. So for sure, that is a current that runs very deep in our collective conscience, if such a thing exists. And that's why, in many ways, I think it's been very important to try and turn around the artillery, the moral artillery, and train it upon the creditor. And thankfully, or fortunately, the creditor class did a lot of that itself. With 2008, and in the revelations that just came streaming out after 2008, for months, for years on end, front page stories about the swindling and the machinations and the scamming and the predatory behavior of these banks. It really did perform a lot of work in eroding the legitimacy. However, there's still a lot of stuff that qualifies as emperor's new clothes that is just not in the public mind, about the creation of money, for example, and the ability to conjure up money at will. And if people really knew what was happening when they signed a bank loan, that the money doesn't exist hitherto. It's only when you sign the bank loan that the money comes into existence. And at that moment, the bank is allowed to enter the full amount, the full estimated amount of loan service to its assets, right? Electronically, of course. But the bank becomes so much more wealthier, and it increases its assets the moment that you sign that bank loan. But it's money that's created. It doesn't exist hitherto. And that there has to be a term for that goes beyond risk spread. It's a kind of mind fuck in a way. The people, and everyone in the financial industry knows that this is how it works. And occasionally it gets out to the public, but people will not believe it because they can't imagine that this is how it works.